Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Network. My name is Keith. I am your host today, and on certain days, Wednesdays and Sundays are the days that I host the Sci-Fi Podcast. And Sunday is Hyperion Book Club Day. We might be doubling up on it this week just because I really love this book, and I want to talk about it more. So this week we are talking about Chapter 5 of Hyperion, which is the story of one of the characters by the name of Braun Lamia. We are entering into kind of like the mid-tier stretch, if you will, of the group's overall journey to visit the Time Tombs and the Shrike. And we kind of get some interesting exposition, actually a very interesting development. So I don't know if I mentioned this last week. I think I may have. I can't remember if it was in Chapter 5 or Chapter 6. One of the members of the party has mysteriously died while the party was traveling on the ship that was sailing over the top of the Sea of Grass that I mentioned last week. I can't remember his name off the top of my head for some reason, but he is a Templar, which is a race of genetically modified clones who their purpose in the universe hasn't really been thoroughly explained, which is one of the big reasons why I was so bummed that we didn't get to hear his story, because he seemed really interesting. They were not able to ascertain the murderer or any murder weapons or anything like that, though I do think that it is interesting that Simmons would kill off this character right before telling like a private investigator story, which, you know, of course, there isn't anything in this book that Simmons hasn't done intentionally. He's seems to be a pretty incredible writer, in my opinion, and I've been impressed with everything that he's done so far. The chapter either starts out with, I think it does start out with them trying to figure out who killed the gentleman. He was supposed to be the person who would tell his tale next, but as he is no longer with us, at least for now, as we all know, on Hyperion, death doesn't seem to be all that permanent. It seems to be kind of relative. Time in itself is relative in some capacity. So, which is one of the main points of the book, I believe. But so we got to hear Braun Lamia's story. Braun Lamia is a private investigator who has been pretty staunchly against sharing the tales that everybody's been telling. She's been very private and reserved about her particular journey and where she is at, and hasn't really wanted to tell people all that much about herself. She seems secretive in a way that is suspicious. And if we remember from the very beginning of this book, there is a member of the party who is an informant to the ousters. That is something that has been pretty woefully overlooked over the last few chapters. In fact, so much so that I forgot about it until I just mentioned it now, because I was talking about Braun Lamia being suspiciously closed off from everybody else. And then suddenly willing to share her tale. It's definitely interesting that she kind of had such a quick change of heart, if you will. I have overall found all these chapters to be very riveting. This one didn't have enough to do with the Shrike for my particular taste, because I just love everything about the Shrike, the premise of it, how it functions in the universe is fascinating to me. I think that's because it's Simmons' best form of theological commentary, and like how humans might interact with some sort of like deity being that they can actually look upon and not just die instantly, like the way that like most Judeo-Christian or Westernized faiths kind of look at gods, or the condition of existence of a god. And so Braun Lamia's tale is much more focused on kind of like purpose, I guess. It's a little bit more science fiction-y, and it feels a little bit more short story-ish. As far as like her being the only female character and whether or not she's a strong character, I kind of was a little disappointed to find that like she doesn't really feel that, well, she feels strong enough as a character in comparison to like most of the other characters. I guess she's kind of as unassuming as the professor whose tale we heard last, whose daughter was the one who had the accident in the time tomb. She kind of as irrelevant as him. I feel like there's like 3 or 4 primary players in this, that being the consul, General Cassad, Martin Salinas. Those seem to be the people who talk the most. Father Hoyt doesn't have that much dialogue outside of the story that he tells. And then again, the gentleman who just told his tale doesn't have much dialogue. And then, of course, the Templar who died has not had much dialogue at all. If I'm thinking who's left, I think the consul's tale is the only one that's really left, as far as, because there's 7, and we're on chapter 6, and one of them died. So that means that, yeah, we get to hear the consul's story next. And the consul is kind of like the main character, though he hasn't really been given a name, which I find interesting. Very Cormac McCarthy. If you're unfamiliar, Cormac McCarthy wrote a book called The Road, which I highly recommend. It's absolutely incredible. I've loved reading every page of it. I've read it 2 or 3 times, once in high school and once as an adult, at least once as an adult. And it's very moving and powerful. We might do that on this podcast. It is post-apocalyptic, so it would technically fall into sci-fi in some capacity, though I don't know if it meets the requirements of like Alienus Novus that I've talked about ad nauseum on here, just to throw as much Latin as possible in the first 10 minutes of this podcast. So Braun Lamia grew up on a planet, the name of which I can't remember off the top of my head. I really should start taking notes. For that, I apologize. But she grew up on a planet that had like extra gravity, so she's a little bit shorter, a little bit more stocky. She's described as being a very handsome and beautiful woman, very outgoing, or very like not necessarily magnanimous or outgoing, but just generally magnetic would be the way that I would describe her. She kind of attracts certain people to her in some capacity. So she works as a private investigator. I think Lavinia is the name of the planet, now I'm remembering it. But she works as a private investigator, and so the story that she tells is kind of like, it feels very 1950s film noir in some capacity, especially the beginning of the story. It feels like Simmons kind of used this as an opportunity to play with some tropes in his book, which he hasn't done as much in other stories that have been told. They've all had kind of like somewhat subtle references to specific science fiction tropes and things like that, but they haven't been as like blatantly about like a science fiction or a film noir type thing as this particular chapter was, which I really did enjoy, the kind of like break from the typical stylistic choices that Simmons has been making. He does an excellent job of spinning a tale in this particular chapter, though I will say there were a couple parts that seemed a little bit confusing. And this chapter didn't hold my attention as much as the other ones did because of like the lack of the Shrike, and it was a lot of, I guess, connecting other points. Weintraub, by the way, that's the name of the other character, the character whose daughter is Rachel, M. Weintraub. Anyway, sorry, just randomly popped into my head. But this novel is starting to feel in some capacity kind of like a Quentin Tarantino movie, like a classic Quentin Tarantino movie where you have all of these miscellaneous backstories or seemingly random occurrences happening within close proximity to each other that all of a sudden add up to like one final, like particular situation or one final resulting situation. And I find that to be pretty appealing, and it's a very good storytelling mechanic. So I am looking forward to seeing kind of like the fruition of everything in some capacity. Though I will say, I do think that it is kind of like a bit of a, not a cliche necessarily, just kind of like it is a trope in its own capacity. So I'm going to start talking about Braun Lamia's story right after this first quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco, ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Chatting about the departing from the kind of standard writing style that Simmons is making in the chapter 5 of Hyperion. We were kind of covering, what I liked about that, the fact that it was very thematically like a film noir type feel. So we were just kind of finishing up that discussion. So now we're going to get into what the chapter was actually about, and then hopefully by the end of it we'll be able to draw some critical thinking conclusions, though this one is not necessarily as full of critical thought as I would like it to be, at least not critical thought in things that we haven't covered before. So the chapter starts out with like a pretty standard film noir introduction. We've got this interesting gender role reversal where normally we have like a dude sitting in an office smoking a cigarette and, it's raining outside, what have you. So instead we have a female who is sitting in her office in the middle of an industrial center, which is, again, right on par with like a film noir style thing. So we have a female or a woman sitting in her office, and it is not raining outside, but dewing from a leaking, like water pump or something like that in the alleyway to the next of her. So we get kind of everything that we would normally get for a film noir introduction. She even kind of talks about it in the same way. It's really funny. Literally, the beginning of it is a guy walks in, and I could basically, she says, I could smell that he was trouble. Like, I'm not sure if he was crazy or if I'm crazy, and that type of thing. So I think that is really interesting in some capacity, because whenever you can kind of swap gender roles, it adds a new dimension and understanding to a particular role. And while Simmons is a male author, and I am just a dude, I do think that there is some kind of like interesting ways in which this particular chapter examines what it would be like to be a woman in this particular role. Though I don't know. I'm not one for like gender theory or for feminist theory. I took one class in college on it, and I think I did well. I think I got like a B+, if I remember correctly, which is pretty good. But generally, I'm not super familiar with it. So I don't know as far as like representation and things like that, if it was done super effectively, but I felt good about it overall. It didn't feel skeevy in any regard. Like, a lot of science fiction authors, when they have a woman, it's, normally the woman is kind of like a damsel in distress, and this woman is in no more distress than any of her male counterparts have been, and the story that she's centered around is very similar to Cassad's story in some capacity, so I didn't feel like it was being treated with any less like clout or regard than any of the other stories. I really enjoyed the rich descriptions of setting and everything that we get, especially since Simmons is trying to channel this very specific aesthetic to us. So that was a really good time. And so the chapter starts out with someone entering into Lamia's office, and he requests her to take a case, of course, and the conclusion that she draws about him is that he is a beautiful man, or it's one of the many conclusions she draws about him, and the case is of a murder. And she says, that it should go to the local authorities, and the client responds that he can't go to the local authorities because they have not been informed of it, and he's worried of informing them of it, and that they might not even give it that much clout because it happened outside of their jurisdiction. And she says, how is that even possible? And it happened on a world where there's no police force. It was on the outer world, or the outback, I think is what they call it. Regardless, she says, who was murdered? And the gentleman replies, I was. And what we find out pretty quickly is that this gentleman, human, quote unquote, is a member of the Techno Corps. And the Techno Corps is a digital cloud of artificial intelligences that have acquired sentience in some capacity, that sometimes have the ability to express themselves via like semi-biological or fully biological means rather. What Simmons calls these are cybrids, which are basically like human robots, I guess, androids. I don't know. They're biological and electronic, or I think they're mainly biological, primarily biological vessels that artificial intelligences can be implanted in some capacity, but they have like ambiguously robotic abilities. They have like some very interesting abilities. One of the things that the gentleman can do is touch Braun Lamia and then kind of send her into like the digital space, because that's part of where he exists. And there is kind of like this very thin line in the Simmons novel that isn't talked about much between like humanity and technology. It seems like they're going hand in hand with each other pretty frequently. But we aren't really told exactly in what capacity that is. So I'm definitely interested to see if he explores that more. But a lot of what this chapter focused on was like the fact that this gentleman was someone who entered into the space as being like perceived as being completely robotic, but kind of becomes more and more human the longer that he interacts with Braun Lamia and the longer that she interacts with him. And there really isn't a major plot twist in this particular chapter, so I will be talking about like all of the spoilers of the chapter there isn't really anything worth omitting, in my opinion, because in order to talk about the impact of the chapter, we have to mention everything. Whereas in other chapters, I've kind of been able to omit little tidbits here and there so that it could kind of keep interest for you guys. This one's definitely a good chapter, and I think we're far enough into the book to where people who are following along are really following along, and they probably know all of these spoilers already. And if you're not following along in the book, I would, ask you why you haven't started yet. I would hope that my podcast gives you at least enough reason to consider it. I know it is a daunting task. I think the book is something like 20 hours long on an audiobook. It's like 900 pages or something along those lines, which is pretty big. It's a pretty big investment, but so far I have not been remiss for having invested in it. I really enjoy it. So I will say that. But regardless, what we find out is that this AI was indeed murdered, and he did experience death in some capacity, but he experienced death in the form of being disconnected from the technological world, the Technocore AI world, the international or the intergalactic web or something like that is what they call it. And so that's a big deal. We find out that some of his memories have been altered by the experience, where specific parts of his memory banks have been wiped. And Braun Lamia is confused by this at first, but she pretty rapidly comes to some decisive conclusions that make it evident that there's something bigger going on here that she should really be concerned with in some capacity. And what's interesting is that we do find out that Braun Lamia is somehow tied to this individual because of her father. Her father is a senator, and because of certain dealings that he has had throughout his, throughout his time as being a senator, we find out that he might be a little bit more closely tied to this individual than Braun Lamia thought at first, which we don't know when she first takes the case. So as we kind of find out more about her backstory and things like that, it becomes a lot more evident to us why she would even be willing to take the case in the first place, because when she first talks to the Cybrid, she seems like she's definitely not going to take it, and even she in her story says, I don't know why I took this case in the first place, which I found to be interesting, of course, but I would guess that some part of it is kind of similar to how everybody else who's interacted with Hyperion has felt about it. They just don't know exactly what it is that's drawn them to this particular place, but they are being drawn to it nonetheless. So we're going to keep talking about this right after this next quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Why Braun Lamia took the case for the cybrid whose name is Johnny. We find out pretty quickly what the case is about. Johnny was murdered, and he is a member of the Technocore, which means he is an artificial intelligence that exists somewhere in digital space, the digital sphere, and we are kind of trying to get to the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the entire situation that we are kind of going through. So, anyway, sorry. Sometimes I get in the middle of a sentence and then I start thinking to myself, oh, I should talk about this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing, and I get a little bit thrown off. So there is a lot to talk about in this particular chapter. It's kind of like Kassad's chapter, where the more I talk about it, the more I find to talk about, which I find to be riveting and interesting. And I love about this book that almost at like every turn there's something new to talk or be excited about. So we enter into this space where we're starting to, get a case, and we're starting to understand things. And we are figuring out basically that Johnny is an AI who was created and modeled after a particular poet by the name of John Keats. If you haven't noticed, it seems like John Keats and poetry in general have a pretty important role in this story overall. Salinas seems to, at least in some capacity, be blamed for the presence of the Shrike in the first place. So obviously words and poetry have power in this universe, if you will. So I'm definitely interested to see where it is that Simmons takes this particular set of tropes and how he is going to handle all of this material as we move along in the story. So we find out pretty quickly that Johnny was killed by a Templar individual. And what is interesting about that is that the gentleman who has died in this book, the only character who's died, only main character who's died, is a Templar. He's a member of the Templar. So, is there a correlation there? I have no idea. The thing about Simmons and his writing style seems to be that he'll put like a Chekhov's gun in place, and you'll think, oh, this is for sure coming back, and then he'll intentionally deny that expectation by not bringing it back. Or he'll kind of distract you so much that you forget that it was there, which is just an effective use of the trope of Chekhov's gun. So really, hats off to you, Dan Simmons, for being such a good author. But regardless, I have just really enjoyed the way that he's been writing. And so, I mentioned that at the top of the podcast. There's no more need for me to sing his praises halfway through. So we find out that Johnny is designed based off of John Keats. And so now what we get into after that is kind of like, why is it important that he's designed after John Keats? And what we're finding out is that there seems to be a lot of conflict around whether or not Hyperion should have been incorporated into the hegemony. There are a couple of groups who have very vested interests in whether or not the hegemony is actually, or whether or not Hyperion is brought into the hegemony. And one of those is the Technocore. Now, what we find out about the Technocore is that they make a living and they make money, basically, off of the practice of prediction. And now, something that I do want to mention, because Braun Lamia's story is the way that it is, and because of the way that it's written in contrast to the other stories, I have a hard time with believing every aspect of it. I believe that in some capacity, in this particular chapter, Simmons is introducing us to the fact that we might have some unreliable narrators, and I think she's one of them. In the very first tale, if you remember correctly, Father Hoyt didn't reveal all of the information about his story when he was telling it. The consul had to kind of stumble upon it and find out information about it later. And I have a strong suspicion that this next chapter is not going to be a tale. It's going to be us as an audience finding out all of the secrets that were kept throughout the telling of these tales in other capacities. We may even revisit certain parts of them to find little nuggets of truth that were hidden. It seems to me that there is a lot of mystery just in this novel in general. So the chapter that focuses on the person who would be the most mysterious, as in a person who works with mysteries and investigations, I think it would be fitting that after that chapter we get a chapter where we kind of find out the truth about a lot of different individuals. And one of the things that makes me feel that way is that Johnny is wealthy. He's super wealthy. It seems like he just has an unlimited amount of money, but it's never really revealed how he makes all of the money that he makes, or why he has access to the resources that he does. I believe in some capacity that there are individuals who simultaneously wanted to see him murdered, but also simultaneously wanted to see him actualize in a particular way. And that is kind of evidenced, again, getting back to the Technocore, by the fact that the Technocore makes a living off of predicting things. And they have a vested interest in what they call the next step in evolution for mankind, or for existence in itself, where existence is always plugged into this digital web of knowledge, and people are able to know things instantaneously. Information is constantly being exchanged across these these infinite gaps of time and space, and it creates a new form of being, and they believe that they are part of that new form of being, and that mankind in some capacity is no longer necessary. And that is evidenced by the tension in relations between the hegemony government, who Braun Lamia has some associations with, and the Technocore government. The Technocore government is actually found to have been creating a new Earth in some capacity, where they are, putting cybrids who are modeled off of old Earth individuals to kind of repeat Earth's history in some way. But what they're finding is that when they build a model of an individual off of the information that they have on that individual, that there's still something missing, and that thing becomes aware of the fact that it's aware that it isn't real. It's a cyclical self-awareness type thing, which I find to be very interesting in its proposal. And this is proposed by a character by the name of BB, who is, I guess, your quintessential 90s hacker is the way I would describe him. He's one of the people that Braun Lamia uses regularly for information, and kind of is a friend of hers, and meets an unfortunate end. But what we find out is that Johnny seems to be going through this process of attempting to become human. And what that basically means is that some portion of his artificial intelligence would be lost to the web. He would be 90% human. He would have a little bit extra compared to a regular human as far as access to information is concerned, but he would be human. And there isn't really... It's funny, it seems like there should be a lot more fanfare around this particular thing, or this particular occurrence, but there doesn't seem to be much. It seems to be something that has never been done before, but when they accomplish it, it kind of is glossed over pretty quickly. And I think that that's due in part to the fact that ultimately Johnny dies at the end of the chapter without fulfilling his desire, which was to travel to Hyperion, which he believes is built into him as a desire because he believes himself to be John Keats. At least by the end of the chapter, he believes himself to be John Keats in some capacity. And he thinks that John Keats was given knowledge of Hyperion prior to his own death, as part of the fact that he had some sort of telepathic connection to the future with his self in the future because of the, whatever metaphysical or magical thing that Simmons is kind of introducing into this particular world. I would say in some capacity it has to do with the Shrike, but because we don't get any direct interactions with the Shrike in this particular chapter, I don't really know what to say about it. But again, I don't feel like this chapter did enough exposition for me to feel like it was conclusive on anything in particular in regards to story. So a lot of the conjecture here is just going to be based off of like what it is that Simmons is trying to say about the human experience and things like that. So we're going to take another quick commercial break, and when we get back, we'll keep talking about this subject.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
What this chapter was about, kind of spoiled that Johnny dies at the end of it, and why it's important, both in the grand scheme of things and what it is that Dan Simmons is trying to say about this particular, or about the human experience and about all these things that are happening in this book. So, Johnny, ends up finding out that he was killed because he was on a quest to become human in some capacity, or in some greater capacity than he currently is. And part of the reason that we could, hypothesize that he was, had his life taken and his memories altered was because the Technocore has a vested interest in him remaining connected to the Technocore in the capacity, or as a member of the Technocore. I mentioned that the Technocore makes its living off of predicting things and kind of like is able to anticipate moves. And that is all based off of a set of algorithms that were developed by a seemingly infinite number of AIs working in conjunction with each other in order to draw some concrete conclusions about the universe. And what we find out is that the Technocore has predicted that there is going to be an inevitable all-out war that will occur between the Ousters and the Technocore and the humans. And they basically have like two conclusions about the future, and both of them require this war. But there exists a factor that cannot be taken into consideration, and this is part of why they have a vested interest in Johnny and why they have a vested interest in Hyperion being brought into the hegemony. And that is because the Shrike and the Time Tombs represent an anomaly in their algorithm that prevents them from being able to accurately predict things beyond a certain point. Because the factors on that particular world, it's not that they're unpredictable, it's that they kind of don't exist in the same capacity that everything else exists. And so I think a lot of what this chapter is talking about, and a lot of the point of this chapter, is to talk about existence itself and like what kind of things qualify as existing and like what is the impact of existence. A great example of this is when Johnny, after he decides he wants to become human and travel to Hyperion, when he has decided that after Lamia has discovered who it was that murdered him, he and Lamia go to BB, and BB says, "Oh my gosh, I'd get access into this like digital realm. That sounds really cool. I'm totally in." And so he is the one who goes in to basically extract Johnny's consciousness from the digital world in order to implant it exclusively in a biological vessel. And the process, unfortunately, takes BB's life as well. And when Lamia and Johnny come to outside of the digital world, Lamia sees that, Johnny's head literally exploded. I don't know exactly how they can explain that. It's like some sort of security measure that exists within the digital world, what have you. Suspension of disbelief in this book is not really a factor because it's so gosh darn well written. So I have a hard time trying to logically explain things. I'm sure that there's a way in which you could explain it. But he's dead, and Lamia is very upset at the fact that he's dead because it feels like there's really not much of like a legacy left behind by his actions. But he's done something that no one else has done before, and that is be a human, a born human, who had full and complete access to the digital world for even the briefest of seconds and moments. And not only did he have full and complete access, but he completed the task that he had set out to do. And that is something that no one else has ever done before. Which I find to be very interesting because Johnny makes this point, but Lamia feels like it was useless. She feels like there was really no need for BB to die in this effort because it hasn't really accomplished anything. Johnny is human, but it doesn't seem like much has changed about him. And what's interesting is that she was worried in some capacity that he would change substantially and that he would not remember a lot of things because he was going to basically be detached from the digital world where all of his data was stored. And he seems to remember everything. And in addition to that, he still seems to be connected to the digital world in a more profound way than a regular human being is. So BB's sacrifice seems to become less and less pertinent as we go on. The only reason that it seems Johnny is pertinent in some capacity is that he can experience death in some way. And so we get through this chapter, which is marked as being a certain amount of time long in the audiobook, but it didn't feel like it took that long to listen to it. I am suspicious that perhaps the chapters are being labeled as longer than they actually are or shorter than they actually are as part of the way in which Simmons would like mess with people in time, because there is a lot of production value that's been put into the audiobook. So I would not be surprised at all if there's some sort of funkery going on with all of that. So take that for what you will. But as we progress through the chapter, we move pretty quickly. Johnny gets turned into a human, and then they end up going down into like this like slum area in order to hide out because Johnny's worried that he'll be hunted by the Technocore. And then for some reason they run into these like mercenaries or violent gang members, and they end up in this like all-out battle because they're trying to get to the Shrike Temple so that the Shrike Temple will send Johnny, because the Shrike Temple kind of exists outside of like the hegemony and the Technocore as far as like political things are concerned. Like even when we get towards the end of the chapter, we find that the police don't want to deal with the Church of Shrike or the Shrike temples. The cops don't go near them. And so they're trying to get to the Shrike Temple, and there's this all-out battle in the middle of the streets where Johnny and Lamia, they basically like deck themselves out in armor and kill a ton of civilians while they're trying to fight against this random group of like gang members who are trying to kill Johnny for like some unknown reason to us. It's kind of indicated that it's like got some sort of like revenge narrative to it perhaps, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's true either, because to me it just doesn't seem clear. Their motives don't seem clear, and that kind of bugs me. But either way, there's a lot of weird stuff that happens in this chapter, which again is why I feel like it's Simmons telling us like, hey, this isn't really the real story. This isn't the real gig, especially since it feels so unresolved and there's no presence of the Shrike in any capacity other than the fact that Johnny wanted to go to Hyperion and they try to go to the Shrike Temple. So we are going to keep talking about this chapter 5 in Hyperion right after this next quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
I felt that this chapter is not telling the entire story of what's going on between Braun Lamia and her love interest Johnny, who, as I mentioned towards the beginning of the podcast, is an artificial intelligence that was created based off of the known facts and consciousness around John Keats, who is the poet who wrote the original Hyperion cantos way back in the day, and it's loosely the inspiration for the entirety of the book. I think that the use of like a past poet is just kind of convenient for Simmons and his idea. I don't think that the Hyperion cantos necessarily have anything super interesting to say, though I haven't read them, so I can't say that for sure. So if you do read them and I'm totally wrong, please let me know. I will also probably read them before the next podcast, so then I can be a good source of information rather than not a good source. So a big part of the reason that I don't think that the full story was told about Lamia and Johnny is that at the end of the story, well, it just ends very abruptly. There's no resolution. It's kind of similar to how Father Hoyt's story ended, where he kind of just said, like, okay, and that was it. And that's the end of the journal. And he says that he went and did something, and it just seemed kind of nonchalant and uninteresting. And this chapter doesn't necessarily end nonchalantly or uninterestingly, but it definitely doesn't end in the same way that most of the other chapters do, because Johnny dies in Lamia's arms on the steps of the Shrike Temple. And as he dies, he inserts his consciousness into the brain stunt on the back of Lamia's head, which, as I've kind of mentioned earlier in the podcast, there's this like very thin line between technology and humanity with Simmons. It feels like he's pretty consistently playing with like, how far down the path of relying on technology and enhancing our bodies can we go until we are essentially just like robots, which, again, is kind of a theme in this chapter. Not to go down a rabbit hole, it's very easy with this particular book because there's just so much content around every corner. But we find out from Braun Lamia that she is actually pregnant with Johnny's child. And that is because they, obviously, how people get pregnant. That's, this is a PG podcast. I'm not going to go too much into detail with that. But basically, she and Johnny became lovers at some point. And so she is pregnant with Johnny's child, which she would only have been able to become after he had become human. So there's a very brief period there. And then he also inserts his consciousness, supposedly, into Braun Lamia. So she's carrying it with him in some capacity because he had retained certain abilities. Even when he became a human, he retained certain abilities that he had as a cybrid. What's confusing to me is that there's really no explanation as to how it is that he's able to accomplish the technological feats that he accomplishes. There's no, it's kind of like, do androids dream of electric sheep? The body composition of these, artificial intelligences that have been put into humanoid bodies isn't really described in too much detail. So there's a little bit of confusion there that kind of frustrated me. But Johnny's able to put his consciousness into Braun Lamia. And kind of what gets me about the end of this chapter that makes me feel a little confused and also adds to the fact that I really don't think that we're getting a reliable narrative here is that Father Hoyt specifically says, oh, so you are of the cruciform as well. You, too, carry the cruciform. And what's interesting is that Father Hoyt didn't tell everybody that he was carrying a cruciform. In fact, he hasn't said that to anyone other than the consul, and even the consul only found out because he literally interrogated Father Hoyt in exchange for drugs, because Father Hoyt needed to take these like incredibly powerful painkillers in order to be able to travel in space, because the farther away from Hyperion he is, the more his multiple cruciforms hurt. And so we didn't know that the group didn't know that he had a cruciform. At least if I remember correctly, they don't know. Though it would make sense if they did know. I can't remember if he tells them about one, but not the second one. So, regardless, he says, you too carry the cruciform. And I think that is kind of like really interesting. Well, obviously it's really interesting. That's why I'm talking about it. It's interesting to the plot of the book because there's some sort of implication there that the cruciform contains a consciousness and isn't just like a biological mass. And so there's kind of like this interesting Cartesian dichotomy that's happening here within these statements of like, you know, where is the separation of body and mind, and can the two things exist separately? Can two minds exist within one body? That type of thing. And I don't necessarily know that Simmons is drawing any conclusions, though I think the implication here is that like there are individuals who are kind of serving like the symbolic form of a vessel in some capacity to bring certain things or certain people to the Shrike. And often those people or things are part of like discovering whether or not they're even going to be able to understand what's happening. And a big thing that I think contributes to me thinking that this is like a not consistent narrative or like it's an unreliable narrator is that Simmons keeps mentioning this idea, especially throughout this particular chapter, that things are like unpredictable and they're like non-factors. And so it would seem to me that might be a little bit of him trying to hint at us that he's like knocking on the fourth wall in some capacity, trying to tell us like, you know, there are things that you can't really predict in the universe because they exist outside of what is considered to be the normal framework of things. And so in some weird capacity, I have a feeling that this book is going to be reflective of that idea, both in its, like both stylistically and in like the author's choices and storytelling mechanics. So we'll see how that goes in the next chapter, which last week I started listening to this chapter immediately before doing the podcast, and it caused some confusion as to where things were, which is why I wasn't sure if I told you that the Templar guy died. So I am not doing that this particular week. But just to kind of finish things up as far as, you know, talking about Johnny and Lamia, I think that a lot of this chapter is devoted to human nature versus the predictability of humanity in some capacity. A lot of this book has been focused on like religious commentary or theological commentary, and so it wouldn't surprise me at all if Simmons was trying to kind of breach into the world of predestination or kind of dip his toes in the idea of whether or not humans are predictable in some capacity, because we have this very clear dichotomy between AIs and humans, at least as far as the political sphere is concerned, because when Lamia talks to one of the people who she's involved with in politics, she finds out pretty quickly that there is like a dichotomy and a separation between the technocore and the hegemony, you know, one of which is run by humans and the other is run by artificial intelligences who think that humans are not irrelevant, but I guess that would be the word. I'm not totally sure. They're outdated, basically. The AIs believe that they're the new form of consciousness that should be ruling the galaxy in some capacity, but they are unable to predict certain things because of the presence of the Shrike, and I think that presence is also going to be reflected in our ability as readers to predict certain things. So we're going to keep talking about this. We've got one more commercial break, so we're going to take that real quick, and we will be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Maybe some of the overarching themes that Simmons was trying to talk about in this particular chapter with the telling of Braun Lamia's tale. All, feminist critiques aside, in this particular regard, which, eventually I would like to have a podcast perhaps on, the role of women in science fiction, because I'm sure that there's a lot of things that a lot of people have had to say about that. But I would probably need a guest host on that one. I'm just going to wager to guess that I might not have the best insight for those particular things. Regardless, I did really enjoy this chapter, so I want to kind of touch on the overarching themes that I think that Simmons is trying to get at. Again, like I said before the break, Simmons has been spending a lot of time in this book doing a lot of religious critique, specifically in kind of like the style of Nietzsche, where there's like this kind of undertone of like a will to power type thing going on, where he's kind of constantly playing around with this idea of the fact that like ultimately things are really purposeless because there's always like this second opportunity that's being presented to people as some form of either like actual immortality or quasi-immortality. Even in some capacity, Father Hoyt, who is carrying the cruciform of Father Linné, in addition to his own, is like holding up some form of immortality for the Father Linné, because, which is sad, and I just thought about this in mentioning it, because that father wanted to die so badly, that gentleman who had the original cruciform, who we heard the story from his journal, wanted to die so badly that he basically self-crucified himself to the point of overloading his entire body with pain and death constantly so that he could die. And still the cruciform, like he'll exist in some capacity if the cruciform regenerates. If Father Hoyt dies, then 2 will come from him. And so that's really interesting and also very terrifying. What's kind of interesting just in general about this book overall is that all of these stories seem to be getting closer and closer in proximity to Hyperion. Like, the fact that Braun Lamia is still pregnant and no one could tell, to me says that the fact that she was selected for this pilgrimage is kind of, I don't know, she's either like destined for it and all of these things happened in close proximity to her leaving, or like she got to go because of what happened and because she was on she was literally on the steps of the temple when Johnny died. So that being the Shrike Temple. So I'm interested to see like how the consul's story pans out, because like when we first started, Father Hoyt, his story was from the perspective of somebody who had been to Hyperion a long time ago, as was General Cassade's, as was Martin Salinas's. And then when we get to Weintraub's story, we find out that the daughter that was injured in the time tombs is still alive, and it's the one he's carrying with him now. And she has weeks to live as she ages backwards. And which is just, I don't know how that's going to go. There's a lot of ways in which this book is kind of like throwing these constant curveballs, like, how is this going to resolve? All of this stuff is coming to a head, and you kind of don't even realize it. I keep forgetting that there are backstories that are kind of like destined to happen in some capacity that I just am not thinking about. Rachel will die within a few days if they don't get to the Shrike. If Hoyt dies, 2 human being things will spawn out of him because he has 2 cruciforms. Salinas, there's not really any implication of what happens when he dies, though I wouldn't be surprised if he is one of the people that Cassad saw on the tree in his vision. And then Cassad obviously wants to kill the Shrike. The Templar also wanted to kill the Shrike. He had brought with him like some secret weapon of this thing that like manipulates super powerful magnetic fields. And it's one of the things that the Templars use for their interstellar travel. So it's very powerful. They wouldn't even open the box that contained this thing because it's technically like a living organism in some capacity that has like semi-sentience. So I don't know. They didn't explain it much. Simmons seems to kind of just be constantly planting these little Chekhov's guns throughout the story and kind of distracting us with these fairy tale / allegoric type stories and kind of like making you look at the book as if it's a chapter book or like a series of short stories. And then I kind of feel like all of it's going to come to a head like out of the blue in some capacity, or that it won't at all, which would be really frustrating because there's 3 books in this series, and I don't know if you guys are going to want to hear me keep talking about it, but if this book doesn't resolve enough for me, I'm definitely going to talk about the next one. So I apologize in advance if that is the case. But regardless, it's just really interesting. And so I think that is something also that Simmons is kind of trying to point out to us as individuals, is that we kind of lose track of what ought to be important. We're busy thinking about these particular narratives in particular ways at all times rather than focusing on the things that are coming to a head around us. Kind of like, spend so much time hypothesizing about what could be rather than realizing what is happening in the now. And what's happening in the now is that someone is pregnant, someone has 2 cruciforms, someone plans on killing the Shrike, someone may have created the Shrike, and someone has a baby that's going to die in the next couple of days. So there's just a lot happening here, and I think that that's absolutely one of the things that Simmons is trying to say, is that there's always a lot happening, and there's always all of these narratives of individuals that are constantly interacting with each other in this really ugly mess, and it just seems kind of like, it seems as if it's intentional when all of it comes to a head. When some particular scenario comes to fruition, when some particular scenario comes to fruition, it seems like everything that happened in that scenario had to be intentional. But like 9 times out of 10, it's happenstantial. So in some capacity, it makes the Shrike even less human that it seems like everything is intentional. Every single individual who is on the pilgrimage seems to have had some form of like specific interaction with some aspect of Hyperion that ultimately ends up making multiple parts of a whole, or maybe represents the different parts of the journey for Hyperion, because again, time is a very important theme throughout this entire novel. But I really am looking forward to what happens with all of this stuff. I know I've said that like 3 times in the last 10 minutes, but there's just a lot. And there's a lot to this book. It's very dense. And yeah, I should be still covering more themes, but I'm running out of time here. Another theme that we might take a look at in the particular story of Johnny is like this idea of like what constitutes human versus not human. Because Lamia views, and she makes specific mention of the fact that she views Johnny as being human, even though he's from the Technocore and he's an automated or an artificial intelligence rather than like rather than an organic human being, quote unquote. So he's kind of playing with that line in some capacity. There's just a lot. Again, that's the second time I've said that in the last 2 minutes. There's just a lot. So I'm not going to be able to cover it all. So that's where we're going to end today. So I appreciate everybody listening. I apologize if I'm getting a little scatterbrained. We're getting towards the end of this book, or at least the middle point of the book, and so it's starting to get a little hard to keep track of everything. So we'll definitely be talking about Chapter 6 on Wednesday, so keep your ears out for that. And then we'll probably be working with another GSMC podcast host to do some co-hosting shows on another book. So we're probably going to be doing a lot of book content from here. So I'll try to let you guys know in advance what it is that we're going to be reading and how much of it we're going to be covering, so you can kind of at least keep up in some capacity. So thanks again, guys, for tuning in. Really appreciate your time. Hope you're staying safe out there. I know I've said this every day or every podcast for the last few weeks, but it looks like things are kind of getting to a place where we might finally have a new baseline for normal, which would be really great for us, because I know me personally, my mental health has been suffering from being stuck inside all the time, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So definitely hang in there, everybody. It's not as bad as it seems, and the sun will come out eventually, just like we will get to go out eventually. So thanks again for tuning in. Hope you guys have a great day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.